Again, good morning. I'd like to just reiterate very briefly what Ian said. First of all, I want to thank FASS, especially the Office of Research, for putting on this event, and would also like to thank everyone for their attendance this morning. I promise I'll be brief. So the title of my recent research, I have various titles. This one happens to be the one I chose today, Rice Politics in the Importing Countries of Southeast Asia. So what I've been studying is a kind of post-Green Revolution rice politics in these three countries, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia. So what I need to do first is what political scientists or social scientists would call case selection justification. So why these three cases when a lot of other countries in Southeast Asia either consume a lot of rice or grow a lot of rice? First of all, these three countries are Green Revolution success stories in the sense of particularly a production spike in the 1970s and the 1980s. A very classically Green Revolution where there was most of the increase in rice production was made through yield increases, through a set of technological advances in the industry. However, even though they had these spikes and some of them became exporters very briefly, since then, most of them still produce rice, what I would call in abundance, so unlike Singapore, but are chronically under the national requirements. National requirements including food consumption, but also buffer stocks or stockpiling. And that's what separates these three from some of the mainland Southeast Asian countries that are the exporters. For example, historically Thailand, more recently Vietnam, and even more recently Burma, although Burma was, of course, much more historically. What else? So therefore, since they grow a lot, but not enough, these three countries are really riveted, or have been for decades, by this crucial question, this contentious, what they call rice self-sufficiency debate. Now, it took me a little while. I didn't realize that people use the term self-sufficiency when they only grow 70% of their requirements, but they call it a self-sufficiency rate. So please bear with me. So it's very contentious. And the question is basically, how much should we grow and how much should we import? Seems like a very simple question, but it really entails or hits upon much, much greater political economy questions of significance. It has to do with how much of an industrialized or modern economy should we have? What should we do about our agrarian roots or agrarian past that people still want to uphold its values and its cultures? What about the expenditures? Growing rice in these countries, particularly under the Green Revolution, proved successful, but very expensive. Of course, that concerns land issues, right? What do we do about this land? Should we reserve land for rice growing? Should we reserve it for palm oil? Should we reserve it for industrial estates, housing estates, or golf courses? Of course, it concerns issues of poverty, because most rice cultivators in the region are quite poor. So it's a question of, does rice help them break out of poverty, or does it keep them in a poverty trap? And it even touches on issues of sovereignty. There's a big debate whether or not importing too much rice leaves you too dependent on other countries, and then therefore undermines one's sovereignty. This kind of import dependence. So I kind of concentrate on rice imports, and I think of them as a regime, and these food parastatals in these three countries, and their monopolies that they have on rice imports as a network, because the way in which so many actors are involved in the monopoly. And it encompasses interests, institutions, and ideas. This was also quite a surprise when I took up the research a few years ago. I guess it shouldn't have been, but it was. It's an incredibly politicized topic in these three countries. On the one extreme, you have what basically is called food security. Right, that are people who are promoting enough food for a country, but through means such as free trade. Right, it's a market-based approach. It's comparative advantage. Maybe, for example, in rice, they would suggest that the exporters, the large river delta type countries like Thailand, and Vietnam should basically take care of most of the rice growing in the region, and where it's more expensive to grow in some places, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, should be diversifying their agrarian or other economy. This is a viewpoint that's very much put forward and favored by economists and the international financial institutions. On the other extreme, you have the food sovereignty people. These are people who care about agrarian roots or past of a society. They champion things like land reform. They promote state intervention in the rice industry. And they also believe that poverty is caused not because of rice growing, but because, for example, peasants or rice cultivators don't have control over their own means of production. Meanwhile, the food security people say rice peasants are poor because they grow rice. You just cannot grow enough today to make a living for example, family 4, family 5. So the food sovereignty people are the pro-farmer, kind of leftist, civil society, NGO types. And so doing this research for me has been a challenge, trying to kind of balance, kind of thread the middle between these two extremes. My topic has also been not just politicized, but it's also been a moving target. On the one hand, I began this in research with the idea of trying to explain continuity. I mean, the Green Revolution has been decades now. So why are most of these three countries still basically following Green Revolution-like policies? And these strong import regimes that have very strong path-dependent properties. And a lot of this has to do with institutions that got built up around it. For example, the 3 food parastatals. And of course, interest, because importing lots of rice, you can make a lot of money, right? Millions and millions of dollars. And the key mechanism has been the import monopoly license, which again is a direct outcome of the Green Revolution. And you can make tremendous amount of rents out of basically because the rice is so cheap coming from Vietnam and Thailand, and by the time you sell it domestically, there's a markup, and there's millions of dollars to be made. So over decades, you have, like, for example, Bernas in Malaysia. It's part of this, what I call this ethnic state capital accumulation. A lot of it had to do with building capital among Malays, taking capital away from Chinese traders. Bulag in Indonesia went from under the authoritarian regime of President Suharto and distribution of patronage to under democratic conditions, distribution of patronage among political parties. And the National Food Authority, the NFA in the Philippines, patronage has been great as well, but it's a different form. It's been a much more of an individualistic or atomistic kind of political patronage between individuals. The party system in the Philippines is just not as strong. That said, you have this other competing paradigm, right? These groups and these interests want to import, but there's always this pushback of, well, we can import, but you can't import too much. So it continues to be a production program from these 3 governments. And a lot of this, I think, is rooted in ideas of an agrarian past, again, the cultures and values that it's tied to the Green Revolution. It's very successful in terms of production. And so when they get criticized for spending too much money on their rice programs, they always turn around and say, but we've done it, right? We proved in the past that we can grow rice in large quantities because we have evidence, and that's the Green Revolution. And I think that's a kind of economic nationalism. It's also a justification for state intervention in these economies, which states in this part of the world love to do. And of course, the key counter here are the IFIs, the international financial institutions, who have really changed their tune, because in the 70s and 80s, they were great backers of the Green Revolution. It might not have succeeded without their support. But then, with the ascendant rise of neoliberalism in the 90s and to today, they are now backing away, and now they are harsh critics of government interventions in the rice economy. They are more on the food security side of the debate. And then, sorry, I forgot to change the slide on that one. But then very recently, I was interested in studying continuity, and all of a sudden we have this very historic and very recent changes. Institutional transformations, maybe. They seem to be underway in 2 of my 3 cases. In the Philippines, very recently, if you've been following the news, the NFA has now lost its import monopoly under Duterte just this year. So after some 40 years, now they've lost it. Why? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact of inflationary pressures that Duterte was worried about, but there's a very strong kind of pro-market indigenous Filipino policy community in the Philippines. Malaysia, Pakatan Harapan surprise win last year, and their promise in their manifesto that they also are going to liberalize their rice license. And so that, of course, had to do with elections. In Indonesia, you have the status quo. Indonesia doesn't have that indigenous policy entrepreneurialism that's supporting liberalism. Indonesia's agrarian past, I think, ideologically is much bigger in notions of economic nationalism. So these are some of the articles that I've produced on the topic. I'm currently working on a book, but it will include some comparative looks at exporting countries of Southeast Asia, but also Northeast Asia countries, because their experiences in rice and transformations to industrial economies are also very important here. All right, thank you very much.
So I just want to ask, you haven't mentioned the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So what kind of norm the WTO can set for these rice businesses internationally?
Yeah, so
and what's the impact upon this kind of local rice politics?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So usually when you talk about reforms and enforcing liberalization, of course you talk about the WTO in this part of the world. I would have to say it's a little bit of both. On the one hand, yes, all these countries joined the WTO, so they had to kind of reconfigure their rice industries around the rules. So it explains why the Philippines have had this complicated qualitative restrictions regime for so long, because they tried to comply with WTO rules. But there were easy ways kind of around it. They kept basically getting extensions on this specialized regime. The WTO doesn't have that much say or authority to really enforce this stuff on the ground. So there's kind of a compromise. So in Malaysia, Bernas has gotten around the WTO requirements because it doesn't receive subsidies. So without subsidies, it goes like, I guess there's like all these boxes, right? It's like the green box. I think there's like an amber box, and there might be a red box. I don't know the WTO rules all that well. So it's been influential, but there's just ways around it. So you have to comply, but on the ground. So for example, the food sovereignty folks in the Philippines are complaining now that the rice regime is moving towards liberalization, right? Kind of free market import of rice. And they claim that it has to do with WTO rules, but it really doesn't, because those rules have been in place for over 2 decades. So you have to look at why they change now, right? So WTO kind of acts as like this boogeyman for people against the liberalization, and then people who are for liberalization use it to say, oh, we need to comply with these rules. But these rules have been in place for decades. And so it's kind of like this structural kind of framework that's there, but it doesn't really explain policies year to year, who's in what camp. I mean, I think there would be people pro-free market and liberalizing rice trade even without the WTO. They just can now use the WTO as a kind of justification. So it's there, but it's a kind of this kind of structural framework, and there's more interesting things going on within these countries. But of course, the WTO, you're right, does play a role.
I think it will be interesting to examine how rice importing monopolies was used by the ruling government to control rural voters
Right.
I think that's happened in all, including in Indonesia. Jokowi won mostly in East Java because of the farmers. But I think we can also look at how they are changing, and you mentioned the Philippines changing the monopoly because of the new president. Malaysia also may be changing because of the new government. But Indonesia is not changing.
Not yet.
I used to live in Indonesia,
Yeah.
and the problem with rice import is that the middle class, the upper class people want to eat better quality cow hom mali from Thailand, for example, and the price has to be high.
Right.
But if you allow rice import from Thailand and the price is high, the Indonesian rice cannot go up in price to compete with the imported Thai.
Right.
Jasmine, right? I think that's the price politics of rice in
Right.
Indonesia.
Yeah.
I think maybe you can look at, this is another interesting article that you can look at how rice import regime used to control the voters in rural farming areas.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one because the question is, how does that really happen? Because, so, one of the changes from Green Revolution to today is not just production, but also price. So back then, some of the domestic prices were held under the international market price. But today that's kind of flopped. So you're right, rice in case in Malaysia, in the Philippines, I guess I could have put that as another commonality. I forgot to do that. But in Indonesia as well. So now the domestic price is higher than, the domestic price is higher than the international prices. So again, that's what's a lot of the food security people are saying is leading to increased poverty. Because a lot of rice farmers in this region remain net consumers of rice. So they actually buy more than they grow. With a high price, that hurts them financially. So Indonesia has kept its rice prices high, yes, to help farmers, but food security people say, in the end, you're not really helping the farmers because you're still keeping them mired in a cycle of poverty. Yes, they're getting more income than they would, but still not enough. And so and they're buying more. So the question is, Indonesia, in the Philippines, you see this policy entrepreneurial group pushing from an anti-poverty perspective of why imports is pro-poor. And it's shocking how that community has so little power in Indonesia. Anyone who promotes more free trade or rice trade liberalization in Indonesia immediately gets branded as neoliberal, as in cahoots with the IMF, and anti-people, anti-pro people. So the discourse in Indonesia is very, very strong. In terms of the rice supporters in East Java in this election, yeah, that had something to do with it. Although Jokowi imported a ton of rice, actually 2 tons, right before the election, which brings down rice prices, which would actually hurt the pocketbook of the farmers, particularly in East Java. So I don't think they voted just from the point of view of their pocketbooks. I think it had to do with a lot of other ideological issues and religious organizations like NU. But Thailand is, it's a big player here in the regional trade. It doesn't dominate the regional trade as much as it used to now with the rise of Vietnam. And of course, with Burma, Myanmar coming on board, it's going to lead to even cheaper international prices eventually. And there's issues of taste, right? There's issues of, the middle class, what do they want? The upper class who even eat less rice than they used to, right? That's a kind of another irony. As you get richer, you're eating less and less rice. But as you alleviate poverty, poor people are actually moving into eating more rice. So there's a lot of shifting dynamics going on. And I don't know, to me that's why it's a pretty fascinating topic.
Yeah, just one more point. Rice is always on the exemption list country in ASEAN. I think there is no free import and export of rice in ASEAN.
Yeah, in ASEAN, I don't know what ASEAN has these days exactly. I think it's per country. So I know in the Philippines, the new regimes under the new liberalization policy, it's a 35% tariff on imports into the Philippines from ASEAN members, and a 50% tariff on non-ASEAN. So, economists are still complaining about the tariffs. They don't like tariffs, but they're still saying this is still better than the quantitative restriction regime the Philippines had for some 30, 35 years, which induces a lot of corruption. Malaysia is still up in the air. Pakatan Harapan promised these reforms, and there's a lot of backdoor, behind-the-scenes negotiations, but nothing has been announced. Bernas still holds the license. They claim they're going to remove it. To this day, they haven't. Like I said, there's discussions, and they're trying to figure out a new regime. And Indonesia is kind of status quo, kind of going forward. There's been some changes here and there, but minor stuff. Yeah, so the tariffs are still in place, but like some economists say, this is a step forward.
Those are all the questions we have time for. Thank you.
Thank you.